Hi, thanks for joining me. In this video, I want to talk about American federalism, and specifically, I want to think about the question about how did the United States government pick the particular type of federalism that it has today? Because it turns out that there are lots of different ways of arranging a political system, and over the course of American history, we've actually experimented with a couple of different ways of thinking about federalism. So first of all, when America was first founded, the United States government didn't start out as a federation. We actually started out as a confederacy under the Articles of Confederation. But for various reasons that we discussed in a previous video, we ultimately decided that the confederation just wasn't working for us. Now, we could have tried a unitary form of government, which is the government that the British government used whenever we were colonies, but for lots of different reasons, we also decided that we needed something that was more decentralized and more effective for a country that already had previously existing states. So instead, we chose a federation. Now, why might we have done that? Well, there are at least 4 or 5 really good reasons. First of all, federalism allows the government to have a sense of unity where they can address common problems or deal with common threats, but you don't have to have the same level of uniformity that is often the case with a unitary form of government. Different regions, different states can have their own separate identity and try to solve local problems in very different or unique ways. Another thing that we liked about federalism was that local control is possible when you have different sovereign provinces or different sovereign states around the country. And the assumption is that the more local power is, the more local the decision making is, the greater ability or autonomy that local governments have to make their own decisions, the greater the level of democracy that a particular country is going to enjoy. There are also a couple of administrative reasons why federations make sense for countries the size of the United States. For one thing, if you have a federation and you're trying to deal with problems across the region or across the country, federalism allows you to have some level of experimentation, where one state can try to solve the problem of, say, education or healthcare using a specific set of goals or tools. And if it works, then that system can be exported to other parts of the country. But if it doesn't work, then only that one state or that one region ends up having to deal with the problems of its failure. Similarly, federations provide for a lot more effective or efficient government, particularly when trying to deal with specific local issues. For example, where do roads need to be constructed? Or who's going to pick up trash? How do we make sure that the trains run on time? What's the most effective way of providing a public school system or delivering healthcare? How do you license particular industries or professions? All of these can probably be more efficiently held through or handled through a local government, through state capitals, than if everything had to be coordinated through the national government. And again, there's one very logical reasons why we chose a federalism. We didn't like the unitary system that the British had, and the Confederacy had already failed for us. Now, it's important to understand, though, that just because we chose federalism doesn't mean that federalism is perfect. And there have actually been several things that have happened in American history that have caused us to question our federation and how our federation functions, and then to revisit some of the rules or applications of that federation. So, for example, one of the reasons why we picked federalism was that it actually allowed for the possibility of varying degrees of social discrimination across the country. The most obvious of these is slavery, but also how we treated women or people of different religious groups also varied from state to state. And federalism allows that form of discrimination not only to exist, but various forms of discrimination to also expand or prosper. Another problem that federalism can create is that oftentimes region or state can become more important to the identity of an individual than the fact that you're an American or the American country as a whole. Now, certainly this was part of the cause of the Civil War, where citizens of southern states continued to identify more closely with the states that they lived in than the idea that they were Americans or American citizens. And there are parts of the country where this could continue to be true. Texas certainly has a very strong local identity, but Louisiana, particularly the Cajun portions of Louisiana, have very strong cultural and legal differences in the rest of the country. And this idea of localism can become a problem if you need a national response to national issues where one state needs to step in and help out or protect another state. A third problem that federalism can create is something called a race to the bottom thesis. Now, we're going to talk about the race to the bottom at length in a future video, but essentially the argument is that if we have to spend money to provide certain goods or certain social services to our citizens, it becomes necessary to raise that money through taxation. But if a state that decides not to provide social benefits chooses to instead cut taxes as a way of attracting or stealing businesses from other parts of the country, the net effect is that parts of the country that have robust or sound social services may be forced to take away some of the benefits that are provided to their citizens as a way of trying to offset the costs necessary to keep the businesses from fleeing to low tax areas. So, understanding why we might have chosen a federation, well, why have we picked the particular type of federation that we have? In order to answer that question, it's probably helpful to think back to an issue that we've discussed in a previous video. Is it best to think of the United States and its Constitution as a nation composed of the various states, or is it best to think of the United States as a nation of its people? In other words, when our Constitution was written and ratified, was this a Constitution that created a nation where the states played the principal political figures, or did it create a nation where the individual citizens were the ones that were actually primary movers to the political system? Now, in the previous video, we talked about this idea that the United States Constitution, while it's only one document for the last 220 years, we could think of the Constitution as existing in two different regimes. The first regime is essentially the regime that was designed by the Founding Fathers and lasted until somewhere around the 1920s and 30s. Under this regime, you should probably think of the Constitution as very much a document creating an alliance between states. And in a very real sense, the Constitution was really a way of trying to solve a collective action problem or trying to create coordination between the states. But a second regime could also be thought of it as starting in the United States Constitution somewhere around the 1930s, where the American government decided to take seriously the concerns of citizenship rights that were created or first established in the Constitution through the 14th Amendment, and then extended this notion of citizenship rights to include things like economic equality or a desire to end poverty. So going to this first notion of the constitutional regime, how exactly does thinking about the Constitution as an alliance between states or a coordination problem between states help us to understand federation? Well, one way to think about this is to think about the problem of free trade as it's addressed by classical economic theory. Classical economic theory teaches that all countries or all states that are engaging in free trade would be better off by trading freely with their partners with very low or no tariffs, using a relatively common or easily fluid currency, than they would be if they established protectionist policies. Now, the reason for this is that states would have the ability of establishing comparative advantages over the production of goods that they're best at, and then trading those goods with other states or other countries that have different sets of advantages. In this way, all economies grow faster because all economies are producing more effectively. The problem is that while it may be theoretically true that free trade is better, the free rider problem in the collective action problem also suggests that while I want everyone to trade freely with me, I would like for me and my state to be able to cheat, basically to be able to take advantage of the system. Maybe I want to try to find ways of preventing outside goods and services from coming into my state. Maybe that what I want to do is to subsidize my businesses or my farms so that way they can offer goods at lower prices when they're being exported into other countries. Now, this is one example of the problem that the United States faced at the time of our founding. There are 13 different states, and all 13 states would benefit if they could trade freely with one another. And they would also benefit if they could find some way of ensuring fairness between the various states while also protecting themselves from common external threats. But in order to do that, they needed to create a system of identifying when one state was attempting to cheat or free ride on the collective action problem, and then establish a means of enforcing fairness upon the states. And that's essentially what the national government, the national constitution, could be thought of as doing under that first regime of the Constitution. Now, there's several elements in the Constitution that suggest that this might have been what our founding fathers were thinking. First, the national Constitution creates something called the Supremacy Clause, or it has something called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution essentially says that in any area of interest that the national government can speak, it has the authority to do so, and that its rulings, its behaviors are supreme or superior to the states, essentially preventing the states from free riding or cheating on one another. A second clause contained in the Constitution is the necessary and proper clause, also sometimes referred to as the elastic clause. And it essentially says that if the national government has the right to speak to an issue, then once it's determined that it's allowed to solve a problem, the national government can sort of create the tools necessary to fix it. So why does this lead to some sense of the national government as a solution to the collective action problem? Well, while the national government is given these powers, there are also some certain limitations that are going to be placed upon it. Mainly, the Constitution in its original draft or its original form limits the national government to several key areas or topics of control. One of those is interstate commerce. States are not allowed to regulate commerce between the states, only the national government can. Another one is that the Constitution goes to great lengths to keep the states out of foreign relations as a way of making sure that one state doesn't start a conflict or a war that the other states might have to solve. Now, in the U.S. Constitution, as we think of this first regime, we also consider there to be several reserved powers that are kept by the states. A lot of these are things related to identity issues. Slavery was allowed to be decided by local states, for example. How women were going to be treated under the law was a local state issue. Even under the First Amendment, when we read the First Amendment, it begins with the phrase, Congress shall make no law, not that the government shall make no law, or that the states shall make no law. The states were perfectly free to place restrictions upon the freedom of speech or the freedom of press. The states were perfectly free to establish religion or to favor one religion over the other under the original understanding of the Constitution in this first regime. Now, the states were also assumed to have a number of implied powers or inherent powers, like taxation or police powers. And the Constitution also appeared to ensure that the states could not be compelled to use their powers or to use their resources to pursue national goals in areas the national government was not allowed to enter. And finally, the states were also responsible for getting involved in the shaping of the national government through the electoral process. The states set the electoral rules under the first constitutional regime. The states directly participated by selecting who the senators were going to be. The states played a large role in figuring out how the electoral college would be decided because the electoral college is weighted to benefit smaller states over larger ones. When we're talking about this notion of the first constitutional regime, a couple of terms that are often used are dual federalism or layer cake federalism. Now, the idea behind dual federalism is that the powers of the two governments, the national and the state governments, are separate from one another. They're responsible for different spheres of influence. But the layer cake logic also understands that the national government maintains this superiority. It is the top layer of the cake, if you will. It's not allowed to participate in what's happening with the lower level government. It's not allowed to get involved in the citizenship rights or interstate issues, but it is nonetheless containing a certain degree of supremacy. So here's the problem with dual federalism. Dual federalism, the federalism that existed under the first constitutional regime, assumes that economic equality and identity issues are entirely issues of the local government. The national government has virtually no role in trying to make sure that poverty is dealt with, for example, or that minority groups or women are not going to be discriminated against by the religious or social norms of states or local cultures. What this means is that once the federal government, once the national government becomes serious on the nationalization of these issues, the old model of federalism, the dual federalism of the past, it just simply becomes unsustainable. We think about a couple of different versions of what federalism begins to look like somewhere around the 1920s or the 1930s. One way of imagining this is called cooperative federalism, and this is certainly the best way of thinking about how the states decided to work with the national government when addressing problems such as poverty. After all, if the national government is willing to provide health care, for example, for the poor, and if the national government is willing to pay for all or most of it, then providing that assistance to the poor in the state of Mississippi benefits the government of Mississippi, who has healthier citizens that they don't have to pay for or raise taxes for. Another conceptualization that you'll read about is called marble cake federalism. Marble cake federalism assumes the national government becomes increasingly involved in what once were state issues. They coordinate somehow, they cooperate in other ways, but essentially this cake of government is entirely or completely overlapping. Now, the notion of cooperative or marble cake federalism works really well, again, if we're talking about questions of poverty or social and economic equality, where the national government is willing to spend its resources as a way of helping out the citizens, which then help out the states. But if we're talking about other issues, the really complicated issues of identity, cooperative federalism no longer makes as much sense. It turns out that states that want to discriminate or that want to have laws that discriminate against sections of their population aren't particularly interested in working with the national government to end that discrimination. So somewhere around the 1950s or the 1960s, a new model of federalism starts to emerge, and we call this model coercive federalism. The logic of coercive federalism is that Americans around the country begin to take an issue or an interest in making sure that the national government assumes responsibility for a certain level or amount of fairness across the country. You might have populations in the Northeast or the Midwest who become very concerned about segregation in the South, or populations on the West Coast becoming very worried about whether or not women in the middle of the country can have access to reproductive rights. In this model, the national population begins to apply pressure to the national government, who then attempts to apply pressure to the states to provide the goods and services that are being demanded nationwide. The national government therefore needs a series of resources, a series of ways of trying to twist the arms of the states. And in a very real sense, this debate over how much power the national government should have and how coercive they should be and how much power the states need to have to fight back has been most of the story of federalism for the last 50 or 60 years. Now, some of the major areas of controversy under coercive federalism, things related to minority rights, stretching all the way back to the debate over separate but equal, and whether or not it is possible to segregate populations on the basis of race. Questions related to equal pay or equal access for minority groups. When we talk about gender issues, whether or not women should be paid equally to men for performing the same job, or should have equal access to public education in state-funded schools. Do women get access to an abortion? Is same-sex marriage going to be constitutional as an important gender rights issue? Voting, the idea of one person or one vote, faced with the problem of many states at various points in time trying to ensure that some portions of their population have less access to the ballot box than others. We've already talked about the problem of social services, the debate about health care under Obamacare, and religious freedom, the degree to which the government can get involved in religion, or maybe more importantly, the degree to which religious institutions can influence the outcome of government. So a few things that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about American federalism in the modern era. First of all, how important is it to you or to us as the American people that all Americans are treated the same everywhere in the United States? Are you okay with the idea that you may have more or less levels of discrimination in different parts of the country where individuals who are being discriminated against are simply told, if you don't like it here, then maybe you should move? Do you think that the federal government should be involved in protecting these individuals from the states if you do have a problem with this level of discrimination? After all, you could argue that discrimination is bad, but then ultimately it's up to civil society or businesses to address the problem of discrimination, and maybe not the national government to do it. A third thing to consider is, conversely, do you think that it's important for local cultural groups or for states that have strong state identities to protect their local customs or to protect their values, even if that means, even at the expense of individual rights of the citizens who might have moved into the area from different regions, or who potentially have who have ethnic identities other than the dominant population. So thank you for watching. I appreciate you joining me for this video. And if you enjoyed it or you found it helpful, please do check out other videos in the series.